Chapter 21. Friedrich Nietzsche. Sadean man wants a successful world without God. His hunger for such a world is a consuming passion. Because of it, he will forgive anything else in an anti-God, anti-Christ country, provided it is openly against the Lord. All kinds of evil in the Soviet Union and Red China were overlooked or forgiven because of their militancy against God. Mussolini and Hitler were equally anti-Christian in their beliefs, but their superficial compromises with the churches made them anathema. The growing hostility to Christianity became, with many, a dominant passion. In European history, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, with its fruits, Romanticism and Modernism, have been anti-God, but again, not openly so. In the post-World War II era, this anti-Christianism became more and more open, explicit, and aggressive. After World War I, there was a decade of dedicated immoralism, but with the Great Depression, this lost its appeal. Its best literary expression was in the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay. This anti-Christianism was aided by the studied irrelevance of the churches, both Protestant and Roman Catholic. Those which were modernist were not anything other than aliens in the temple, but the professing believers often equaled them in their damage. In the name of purity, one Protestant group does not permit participation in prayer if the leader is not of their group. That is, Missouri Synod Lutheran, refusing to enter the dining hall until after the prayer. This is done even though the pastor praying is someone they came to hear because of his orthodoxy. In other churches, divisions take place over the issue of the quote-unquote rapture, pre- or post-tribulation, and so on. The Roman Catholic circles, much attention is given to purported visions from Mary, which are amazing in their trifling nature. One such quote-unquote vision, dated June the 12th, 1976, Mary requires prayer with fingers together, pointing upwards. Quote, "My child, I am demonstrating the stance that heaven expects of our children in their prayer life. During the holy sacrifice, there is much disrespect evident. You must, during the sacrifice, place your hands together this way and join in spirit with my son during the sacrifice." End quote. In another quote-unquote vision on July the 25th, 1974, Mary is said to declare, quote, "Shorts, slacks shall not be worn in the presence of my son. There will be no rationalization accepted for the commission of these acts of impurity." End quote. This is not to say that the anti-Christians are not commonly very stupid, but the sad part of the matter is that we are plainly told that the unconditional answer of God to prayers for wisdom is to grant it. James 1:5. Very obviously, church people are not interested in asking God for wisdom. Since I was young, I have often urged people to pray for wisdom with virtually no reaction or action on their part. People want things, not wisdom. The French Revolution set as the goal of humanity the ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality. In time, liberty and fraternity gave way to the demand for equality. Equality is a concept that brooks no rivals and finally no equals. It challenges the validity of all authority because it insists that autonomous man cannot be bound by any rules except his own will. This militates against freedom under law in favor of anarchic, autonomous freedom. To be under law is to be under either God and his law or the state and its law. If a man's will is as valid as that of any group of men or of God, man will declare his independence from all extraneous authorities. Moreover, there can be no fraternity with men who have their own sets of personal fiats and decrees. There can then be no legitimate state. According to R.P. Wolf, quote, "If all men have a continuing obligation to achieve the highest degree of autonomy possible, then there would appear to be no state whose subjects have a moral obligation to obey its commands. Hence, the concept of a De jure legitimate state would appear to be vacuous, and philosophical anarchism would seem to be the only reasonable political belief for an enlightened man. End quote. Of course, Wolff's assumption that all men, quote, have a continuing obligation to achieve the highest degree of autonomy as possible, end quote, is an amazing presupposition. It is like a man in the bright light of the sun insisting that all the light comes from his little candle. However, modern man sees the world as something he must remake in order to capture it from God. He therefore makes many amazing statements in the course of his war. Charles Ives, for example, asks, "What has music to do with sound?" Well, what have words to do with meaning, or why should breathing be essential to life? When we challenge the given factors of life, there is no reason to stop at any point. We are then engaged in a radical deconstruction of all things. Leo Steinberg sees all this as the great merit of modern art. In Wolff's summary, quote, "For what in the world requires more courage than, quote, to applaud the destruction of values which we still cherish," end quote. Modern art always, quote, "projects itself into a twilight zone where no values are fixed," end quote. He said, quote, "It is always born in anxiety," end quote, end quote. What de Sade recognized very clearly was the death of all values, which means the death of man and of all things, because it means a war against God and against life. Life is created by God, and morality is the condition of man's life. That to wage war against God and against morality is to wage war against life. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, saw clearly the lukewarm character of the Christianity of his day, but his solution was to abolish good and evil for a radically pragmatic view of life. Like his idol Ralph Waldo Emerson, he wanted to transcend good and evil and make man free of all morality. Beyond Good and Evil, 1885, began with his famous assault on truth, quote, "The falseness of any opinion is not for us any objection of it. It is here perhaps that our new language sounds most strangely. The question is, how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-rearing, and we are fundamentally inclined to maintain that the falsest opinions, to which the synthetic judgments a priori belong, are the most indispensable to us, that without a recognition of logical fictions, without a comparison of reality with the purely imagined world of the absolute and immutable, without a constant counterfeiting of the world by means of numbers, man could not live, that the renunciation of false opinions would be a renunciation of life, a negation of life. To recognize untruth as a condition of life, that is certainly to impugn the traditional ideas of value in a dangerous manner, and a philosophy which ventures to do so has thereby alone placed itself beyond good and evil." End quote. Nietzsche's influence in the United States gained much from Emerson's preparatory work. In the 1930s, as a student, I witnessed the great popularity of Nietzsche's ideas, which faded outwardly as he was seen as a forerunner of Hitler. Nietzsche thus rejected living according to God and his law and truth. He also rejected the humanist's dream of living, quote, according to nature, end quote, as a fraud. He asked, quote, "Why should you make a principle out of what you yourselves are and must be?" End quote. Living according to nature was actually a philosophy of self-justification. Nietzsche wrote, quote, "In your pride you wish to dictate your morals and ideals to nature herself, and to incorporate them therein. You insist that it shall be nature, quote, according to the Stoa, end quote, and would like everything to be made after your own image, as a vast eternal glorification and generalism of Stoicism. With all your love for truth, you have forced yourselves so long, so persistently, and with such hypnotic rigidity to see nature falsely, that is to say, stoically, that you are no longer able to see it otherwise, and to crown all, some unfathomable superciliousness gives you the bedlamite hope that because you're able to tyrannize over yourselves, Stoicism is self-tyranny, nature will also allow herself to be tyrannized over. Is not the Stoic a part of nature? But this is an old and everlasting story. What happened in old times with the Stoics still happens today. As soon as ever a philosophy begins to believe in itself, it always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is this tyrannical impulse itself, the most spiritual will to power, the will to, quote, creation of the world, end quote, the will to the causa prima, end quote. Nietzsche ruthlessly exposed the compromising Christianity of his day and also the smug compromising humanism and its virtual deification of nature. Rather than self-preservation as, quote, the cardinal instinct, end quote, Nietzsche declared that, quote, life itself is will to power, end quote. In this respect, Nietzsche was closer to Orthodox Christianity. Biblical faith sees all men as governed by their original sin, their will to be their own God, Genesis 3:5. Nietzsche's thinking is not only a militant and logical humanism, but it is also a clear recognition and acceptance as a virtue of the biblical doctrine of man. But for Nietzsche, there was no truth. If a man seeketh, quote, I wager he finds nothing, end quote. What then can a man do? If the only reality is the impulse of a man, where does that leave us? Nietzsche's answer tells us that the only reality is what Christians call man's fallen nature. Quote, granted, finally, that we succeeded in explaining our entire instinctual life as the development and ramification of one fundamental form of will, namely the will to power, as my thesis puts it, granted that all organic functions could be traced back to this will to power, and that the solution of the problem of generation and nutrition, it is one problem, could also be found therein. One would thus have acquired the right to define all active force unequivocally as will to power. The world seen from within, the world defined and designated according to its, quote, intelligible character, end quote, it would simply be will to power and nothing else, end quote. Nietzsche was in effect issuing ultimatum to both churchmen and humanistic philosophers. Drop all your pompous pretensions and deal with man as he is, the naked will to power. Nietzsche immediately asks, quote, what? Does not that mean in popular language, God is disproved but not the devil? On the contrary, end quote. The French Revolution, the culmination of the Enlightenment, was a, quote, terrible farce, end quote, which scholars have interpreted to suit themselves, quote, until the text has disappeared under the interpretation, end quote. They have made their own, quote, reality, end quote. Quote, everything that is profound loves the mask. The profoundest things have a hatred even of figure and likeness, end quote. The humanistic philosophers are unwilling to be open about their will to power. The Christians have sought to deal with it neurotically. For Nietzsche, quote, the religious neurosis, end quote, is, quote, connected with three dangerous prescriptions as to regimen, solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence, end quote. For Nietzsche, Christianity was a sick, neurotic pretension. Freud followed Nietzsche in this respect. For Nietzsche, both humanism and Christianity were pretensions in their moral claims. Quote, there is no such thing as moral phenomena, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena, end quote. To be beyond good and evil is to recognize that God is dead and morality is a myth. Every system of morality is a tyranny against, quote, nature, end quote, and against, quote, reason, end quote. A free world does not think in terms of Aristotle or the Bible. Nietzsche's thinking was leading him to an impossible conclusion, which later in his thinking destroyed him. If life is beyond good and evil, and there is no truth, then there is no reason to prefer life over death. He had concluded, quote, morals as timidity, end quote, best describes moral men. Then why not life as timidity? He had allowed for no differentiation. Quote, morality in Europe at present is herding animal morality, end quote. This was an easily made point. Most people usually follow a leader or a crowd, but what makes them better than Nietzsche? The truth. But Nietzsche has insisted that truth is a myth. Are the people wiser to bend to the popular ideas and advance themselves? Or should they, like Nietzsche, arouse anger for exposing lies that are not really lies, since all things are meaningless? Should all argue with Nietzsche and commit suicide? Indeed, suicide in the latter part of the 19th century was becoming an intellectual practice. Nietzsche declared that mankind was becoming degenerate, brutalized into a, quote, pygmy, end quote, and dwarfed. Having rejected all standards, by what standard could Nietzsche say this? Yet Nietzsche wanted philosophers like himself to enlighten humanity. Quote, the real philosophers, however, are commanders and lawgivers. They say, quote, thus shall it be, end quote. They determine first the whither and the why of mankind, and thereby set aside the previous labour of all philosophical workers and all subjugators of the past. They grasp at the future with a creative hand, and whatever is and was becomes for them thereby a means, an instrument, and a hammer. Their, quote, knowing, end quote, is creating. Their creating is a law-giving. Their will to truth is a will to power. Are there at present such philosophies? Must there not be such philosophy some day? End quote. The answer is obvious. Only Nietzsche. Such a person must believe in his own virtues, that is, have a good conscience about whatever he does. Nietzsche resented the morally superior man. Moral superiority was to him a hateful form of elitism. He wanted an elitism based on amoralism, on the Superman who is beyond good and evil, on a contempt for Christian morality. Moral judgment was anathema to Nietzsche. Morality was to him the uglifying of Europe, and especially a trait of women. Women were for Nietzsche a, quote, possession as confinable property, end quote. The great need for him was, quote, the rearing of a new ruling caste for Europe, end quote. As against the prevailing slave morality, there was a need, said Nietzsche, for a master morality in which the rulers determine the conception of good. This is now the 20th century situation, the rulers of the state defining law and morality. In 1887, in the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche further developed his arguments. He charged the Jews with having created, in opposition to the aristocratic equation, quote, good equals aristocratic equals beautiful equals happy equals loved by the gods, end quote, another with having insisted on a contrary one, quote, the wretched are alone the good, the poor, the weak, the lowly are alone the good, the suffering, the needy, the sick, the loathsome are the only ones who are pious, the only ones who are blessed. For them alone is their salvation. But you, on the other hand, you aristocrats, you men of power, you are to all eternity the evil, the horrible, end quote, etc. For Nietzsche, the Jews are the source of this false morality. The Church also carries on this evil. Quote, the Church certainly is a crude and boorish institution that is repugnant to an intelligence with any pretence at delicacy, to a really modern taste. End quote. In my university days, the students who openly affirmed Nietzsche's philosophy before Hitler made it less easy to do so had a happy justification. by their contempt for sexual morality, their advocacy of cheating and dishonesty, and their rejection of quote-unquote bourgeois discipline, they were affirming their superior nature and the fact that their ways were the mark of a superior virtue. One student openly affirmed Nietzsche whilst adhering to a Christian morality, a fact he justified with convoluted reasoning. Nietzsche's hatred of God and morality had its penalty. God, as the creator of all life and the giver of the law, had made man in his own image. What hope could there be for a man so created? The walls were closing in on Nietzsche, and he concluded, quote, "The sight of man now fatigues. What is present-day nihilism if not that? We are tired of man." End quote. Man has a bad conscience because he is imprisoned by a Christian world and life view. Quote, "I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness which man was bound to contract under the stress of the most radical change which he has ever experienced. That change, when he found himself finally imprisoned with the appeal of society and peace." End quote. The logic of this is that man, the animal, must be freed from conscience so that he might kill, steal, and rape at will. This was an amazing statement from a weak professor. Did he assume that the university would be a sacred precinct from the ravages of the new savage? Could he not imagine the obscene travesty of intellectual man that our politically correct and crime-ridden schools have become? Abstract thinking can indeed be very dangerous. For Nietzsche, quote, "Undoubtedly, the bad conscience is an illness, but an illness as pregnancy is an illness." End quote. It is an illness created by a religion and will end with religion. Man must realize it owes nothing to a mythical god. Redemption will come from Superman, the, quote, "man of the future who in this wise will redeem us from the old ideal." End quote. Assuredly, quote, this Antichrist and nihilist, this conqueror of God and nothingness, he must one day come. End quote. In 1883, Nietzsche wrote, "Thus spake Zarathustra." Here he affirmed, according to his sister Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, quote, "All that proceeds from power is good, all that springs from weakness is bad." End quote. Nietzsche saw Zarathustra as the first moralist and used him to destroy morality. It is a confused work, and yet its intention is clear: the death of God and morality, and the birth of Superman. In terms of this, quote, "Once blasphemy against God was the greatest blasphemy, but God died, and therewith also those blasphemers. To blaspheme the earth is now the dreadfulest sin, and to rate the heart of the unknowable higher than the meaning of the earth." End quote. Modern environmentalists are children of Nietzsche, although he would have despised them as he did everyone and everything. An undercurrent of "Thus Spake Zarathustra" is Nietzsche's affirmation, not merely of Superman and the death of God, but of the death of all men, of life. Like the Marquis de Sade, he was affirming that the ultimate triumph of anti-Christianity is the death of God and universal death. Even as Nietzsche hailed the Superman, life as a dancing star and more, he courted universal death and affirmed it. He was filled with hatred. He celebrated death in many ways. He glorified war, and he celebrated the need to be ruthless. He exalted the contempt for a woman of a desert monk while frequenting prostitutes almost religiously. He held, quote, "But I say unto you, your neighbour, love is your bad love of yourselves." End quote. Man shall be trained for war, and woman for the recreation of the warrior. All else is folly. End quote. Quote, "Thou goest to women, do not forget thy whip." End quote. Now, one of the falsest sources of information about Nietzsche was his sister Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who said of her brother that he, quote, was a saint and incapable of carnal desire, end quote. Lou Andreas Salome used Nietzsche's call for a whip to keep women in the line against him. She had two philosophers who were madly in love with her assume the position of animals pulling a farm cart. Holger protested this humiliation, but Nietzsche, quote, claimed that no other pose could more fittingly represent their relationship. He insisted that they be tied to the cart and Lou supplied with a whip, end quote. Quote, Mr. Bonnet's camera caught the rapt ecstasy on Nietzsche's face, end quote. Apparently, Nietzsche had earlier used the statement about a whip for women. It was a few months later that he included the sentence in Thus Spake Zarathustra. By then, he was no longer in Lou's good graces. Nietzsche wrote, with the passing of time, books that were pseudo-Bibles. The language and format were a poor imitation of the Bible. His governing impulse can be seen by his vehement will to be his own, which is the tempter's program in Genesis 3:5, every man his own God, determining good and evil for himself. Nietzsche wrote, quote, But that I may reveal my heart unto you, my friends, if there were no gods, how could I endure it to be no God? Therefore, there are no gods. End quote. Nietzsche stated openly what many thought, and he brought about in time more plain speaking. The death of God school of thought in the early 1970s and basic to much since then did not say God is dead, but rather God is dead to us. He no longer counts in our thinking. Nietzsche held that God died out of pity for man. Nietzsche himself had an intense love-hate relationship towards men. He wanted their recognition and adulation, and he hated them for worshipping other, quote, gods, end quote, before him, that is, other men. He wanted men to forsake God and morality and to hail him as their deliverer. He insisted, quote, They are only to believe in yourselves and in your inward parts. He who doth not believe in himself always lieth. End quote. Thus Spake Zarathustra runs increasingly into madness. In the third part, one section is titled, quote, On the Olive Mount, end quote. 5 years later, he was signing his letters with Nietzsche, Caesar, Dionysius, or the Crucified. His syphilitic brain also led him to see himself as the Antichrist. Meanwhile, he held, quote, Man is something that must be surpassed. End quote. In Ecce Homo, 1888, an autobiographical essay, Nietzsche, quote, proclaimed his immortality, end quote. He saw himself as more learned and more clever than most people because he had no sense of sin. He declared God to be, quote, the greatest objection of life, end quote. Nietzsche recognized the explosive force of his thinking, and in the essay, quote, Why I Am a Fatality, end quote, he wrote, quote, Hope is reborn with me. Thus, I am necessarily a man of destiny, for when truth engages in struggle with the falsehood of ages, we must expect shocks and a series of earthquakes, with a rearrangement of hills and valleys such as has never yet been dreamed of. This concept of, quote, politics, end quote, is thus raised bodily into the realm of spiritual warfare. All the mighty forms of the old society are blown into space, for they all rest on falsehood. There will be wars whose like have never been seen on earth before. Politics on a grand scale will date from me, end quote. He was right, of course, although more were involved in this revolution than he. Society was shifted from a religious foundation to a statist and pragmatic one. The modern state saw itself as beyond good and evil, as simply the power centre. Not only did the most terrible wars emerge, but, quote, peacetime, end quote, became a nightmare. Crime increased as morality was despised. The human race, after Nietzsche, seemed determined to die like him, with sexually transmitted diseases. Nietzsche held that, quote, Christian morality is the most pernicious form of the will to falsehood. the real Circe of humanity that has corrupted it. End quote. But if we are beyond good and evil, all things are equal and no standard for judgment remains. All the same, Nietzsche held that there should be a new form of dating before Nietzsche and after Nietzsche. Quote, the unmasking of Christian morality is a unique event, a real catastrophe. He who throws light upon it is a force majeure, a fatality. He breaks the history of mankind in two. Man lives either before or after him. End quote. Nietzsche's goal was a more radical form of Voltaire's, whose slogan, "Écrasez l'infâme." He cites and then writes, quote, have you understood me? Dionysius versus Christ. End quote. But Dionysius gave him syphilis, a form of judgment. For him, Dionysius was the Antichrist. H. van Ryten, in his study Nietzsche, 1960, very ably called attention to Nietzsche's problem. How can one deny God, deny truth, deny to man anything but an animal status, and still have any standard for judgment? Quote, Nietzsche could not believe in God, and he logically refused to recognize sin. Indeed, he tried to build a culture based on sin. End quote. We cannot understand Nietzsche unless we see him in the line of Descartes, and more proximately of Kant and Hegel. The only real world is the world of ideas, of man's mental construction. Outer reality, if it exists, that is, things in themselves, is unknowable. He could thus declare, quote, it is of cardinal importance that the real world should be suppressed. It is of the most formidable inspirer of doubts and depreciator of values concerning the world which we are. It was our most dangerous attempt heretofore on the life of life. War against all the hypotheses upon which a real world has been imagined. The notion that moral values are the highest values belongs to this hypothesis. The superiority of the moral valuation would be refuted if it could be shown to be the result of an immoral valuation, a specific case of real immorality. It would thus reduce itself to an appearance, and as an appearance, it would cease from having any right to condemn appearance. End quote. Nietzsche had prefaced this with an existentialist affirmation, quote, there are no things in themselves. End quote. It is very important to understand what this means. Beginning with René Descartes, philosophy clarified its direction. Thomism had stressed Aristotle and had used him to, quote, establish, end quote, a quote-unquote proof of the biblical God. It had a mixed presupposition, God and man's reason as its starting point. But Descartes began with the autonomous human mind as his given or presupposition, and with this point of ultimacy went on to, quote, prove, end quote, the existence of God and the physical universe. Between Descartes and Hume, the process of attrition led only one assured reality, the autonomous mind of man. How could one trust sense perceptions to report accurately on the outside world? The only trustworthy knowledge was, in some diminished sense, Descartes' starting point. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. The autonomous mind of man. This conclusion was seen as a threat to knowledge, but it did not occur to these philosophers to begin with God. Instead of, in the beginning God, their premise was, in the beginning, the autonomous mind of man. By Nietzsche's day, Darwin had denied the need for God as creator, quote, scientifically, end quote. His thesis was illogical and racist, since he saw non-Europeans as less developed races. Darwin's, quote, science, end quote, was a concoction of wild, irrational, and unscientific assumptions. Billions of years ago, in a cosmic void, a universe of nothing, an accident occurred, and an atom was created out of nothing. This means spontaneous generation and the creation of something out of nothing. Two unscientific assumptions and the wildest of, quote, miracles, end quote. Then millions, perhaps billions of miracles followed, until with untold numbers of accidental changes, man and this present world appeared. Darwin recognized that such accidents could not create a seeing eye, but this did not deter him. Any preposterous miracle was preferable to God. The philosophers were moving in the same direction. Any answer other than God? The philosophers were moving in the same direction. Any answer other than God? The autonomous mind of man had to be the ultimate rather than God. It was left to Immanuel Kant to replace both God and the physical world with the mind of man. Quote, hitherto, it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, but all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concepts have, on this assumption, ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that the objects must conform to our knowledge. This would agree better with what is desired, namely, that it should be possible to have knowledge of objects a priori, determining something in regard to them prior to their being given. We should then be proceeding precisely on the lines of Copernicus's primary hypothesis. Failing of satisfactory progress in explaining the movements of the heavenly bodies on the supposition that they are revolved around the spectator, he tried whether he might not have better success if he made the spectator to revolve and the stars to remain at rest. A similar experiment can be tried in metaphysics as regards the intuition of objects. If intuition must conform to the constitution of the objects, I do not see how we can know anything of the latter a priori. But if the objects, as the object of the senses, must conform to the constitution of the faculty of intuition, I have no difficulty in conceiving such a possibility. End quote. With such a premise, Jean-Paul Sartre could hold that God was irrelevant to his philosophy. His problem of knowledge was other people. Philosophy and modern thoughts have come to the logical conclusion of their presupposition. The ultimate, if not the sole reality, is the autonomous mind of man, in its existential or momentary thinking, uninfluenced by God or man. What in some is insanity is in reflective men their basic philosophy. In Nietzsche, philosophy and madness met. The most logical conclusions were at one with his delusions. For Nietzsche, there was no thing in itself, nor, quote, a sense in itself, end quote, nor, quote, a meaning in itself, end quote. Nietzsche, more radical than Kant, denied reality to Kant's distinction between appearance and any thing in itself. We have ourselves created a world of values, thus it follows, quote, all is false, everything is allowed, end quote. Quote, to, quote, humanize, end quote, the world means to feel ourselves ever more and more masters upon earth, end quote. Nietzsche left the door open to, quote, God, end quote, as the possible future point of maximum power. In a statement that points directly to the thought of the Jesuit scholar Teilhard de Chardin, Nietzsche wrote, quote, the only possible way of upholding the sense of the concept of God would be to make him not the motive force, but the condition of maximum power, an epoch, a point in the future development of the will to power, by means of which subsequent evolution, just as much as former evolution up to him, could be explained. End quote. To read Nietzsche is to realize how many moderns have, quote, borrowed, end quote, his ideas. Many academicians are simply housebroken versions of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was opposed to the moral channels of life, such as love and marriage. He was, quote, opposed to parliamentary government and the power of the press, because they are the means whereby cattle become masters, end quote. Also he held, quote, the arming of the people means in the end the arming of the mob, end quote. Given his exaltation of the will to power, Nietzsche despised the ideas of compassion, love, equality, and the like. People, he said, quote, demand freedom only when they have no power, end quote. Like Sade, Nietzsche held, quote, nothing else on earth but immoral intentions and action. End quote. If we view things from the traditional and Christian perspectives, but in reality, quote, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral action. End quote. The first of many books on Nietzsche that I read as a young man was George Burnham Foster's Friedrich Nietzsche, 1931. Foster, then, quote, late professor of the philosophy of religion in the University of Chicago, end quote, clearly admired Nietzsche. He recognized Nietzsche's essential anarchism. Nietzsche, he held, was an autocrat whose goal was government by, quote, reason and strength, end quote, for the fittest only. Quote, according to Nietzsche, the great man, the hero of the future, worthy to be master and ruler of men, must necessarily be a criminal, that is to say, a man who knows not good or bad because he is above them, a man who is the scourge of humanity, a man who, in order to realize the expansion of his personality, needs humanity as a field of experiments, as a field in which he can sow suffering broadcast, a man warlike and hard-hearted. The aim of the Superman is a great aim. It is the realization of life in its fullness and entirety, in all its infinite possibilities. End quote. Foster, the modernist, found much to agree with in Nietzsche. He shared with Nietzsche his skepticism and unbelief with regard to Jesus Christ. Deussen wrote of the historical criticism which both he and Nietzsche as students found excellent. This same Deussen was speaking to Nietzsche on one occasion of the Life of Jesus, which Strauss had just then published in the new edition, and expressed approval of the book. Nietzsche quickly replied, quote, the question is important. If you sacrifice Jesus, you must also sacrifice God. End quote. End quote. Nietzsche was right, and we can broaden his observation to say that once you sacrifice any aspect of the biblical revelation, in time you will sacrifice all. You will then follow Nietzsche and de Sade in a hatred of all morality and life. Nietzsche, far more intelligent than the absurd Marquis de Sade, saw the conclusion and pursued it. Nietzsche died in 1900 at the beginning of a century he created, and a suicidal one, like himself. If God is to be abandoned and the moral life with him, as Camus saw in The Rebel, then we must choose evil. By analogy, we must choose sickness and death instead of life. E. Michael Jones, in his excellent study, Degenerate Moderns, wrote, quote, the prime anti-Western fantasy for our age, however, was expressed by Nietzsche. 2 years after hearing the piano score of Wagner's epoch-making opera Tristan and Isolde, Nietzsche made a lifelong commitment to sexual revolution by deliberately infecting himself with syphilis in a Leipzig brothel. Thomas Mann saw in that gesture an act of, quote, demonic consecration, end quote. Whatever the motivation, Nietzsche was outraged when Wagner had second thoughts. When Wagner, quote, prostrated himself before the cross, end quote, by writing Parsifal, Nietzsche flew into a rage not only against Wagner but against German music and all of Europe as well. Turning his disease-damaged eyes southward, he began to discern what he termed the, quote, lewd melancholy, end quote, across the Mediterranean. As an antidote to Wagner's prostration before the cross, Nietzsche discovered Africa. End quote. Cornelius Van Til pointed out that one consequence of abandoning Christianity is integration downward into the void. This means, quote, understanding, end quote, the man in terms of the child in terms of the unconscious in terms of man's primordial and animal past, and so on. In the 1980s and 1990s, this means that political correctness attacks the whole Anglo-Saxon male in favour of women, blacks and other races, provided that these other races are not too successful. Nicholas A. Damask and Craig Cobain were two graduate students at the University of Cincinnati to be awarded graduate teaching assistantships, a mandatory attendance at a, quote, teaching effectiveness workshop, end quote, followed. The sessions began with a quote-unquote teacher. quote, informing participants that all whites were racist and that blacks could not in any circumstances be racist. She stated that white men hold all power in society and that they oppress everyone, ethnic minorities, women, homosexuals, and the handicapped. Furthermore, she went so far as to say that the English language itself is constructed in a manner which makes it oppressive. Anecdotal evidence provided to prove this assertion included, quote, good guys were white, bad guys were black, end quote, quote, stuck behind the 8-ball, end quote, and, quote, blackmail, end quote, as well as many others, end quote. After the beginning, the sessions only went downhill. What has happened to Superman? All the assumptions Nietzsche called for are in place. Why do we see the triumph of the lowest common denominators, the, quote, minority, end quote, people who will neither work nor study, the criminal, the political hacks, the moral degenerates, and so on and on? The, quote, will to power, end quote, should have brought something, quote, better, end quote, to the fore if Nietzsche's thinking was sound. Precisely those things Nietzsche despised are not triumphing in his spirit, if not in his name. Why? To eliminate God from your worldview is to eliminate history. If there be no good and evil, there is no premise for discrimination, then everything is meaningless. One would have to say that the proof of the, quote, will to power, end quote, is to have power. This makes Wagner the victor over Nietzsche. Albert William Levy observed with respect to Sartre's Nietzschean existentialism, quote, the heart of Sartre's strategy for freedom is an attempt to destroy the decisiveness of the past, end quote. If it could be done, the destruction of the past would be a dangerous thing, for to destroy the past is to destroy conscience and history. Nietzsche, a man with a very bad conscience, tried to destroy or explain away conscience. In 1887, he published The Genealogy of Morals, as we have seen, but it failed to work for him. He could not erase morality nor his past. He was a man haunted by conscience and by history. History is the past of men and nations, but conscience is the past made ever present. Conscience means that man cannot escape himself and his history, but Nietzsche was determined to blot out religion and the past. Levy calls this, quote, a will to illusion, end quote. After all, Nietzsche justified the lie as necessary to life. He vindicated the will to illusion. In so doing, he placed himself into a strange contradiction to the will to power. The chronic use of the life that Nietzsche vindicated is a tool of weakness and of slaves, not of a superman. Moreover, Nietzsche's theory of the eternal recurrence of an endlessly repetitive cycle of life hardly means the triumph of Superman. Triumph in history, from creation to the new creation, is true. Nietzsche sought to cut the ground out from under Christianity and ended up undermining his own foundations. In any war against God, man always ends up the loser. John Neville Figgis reported of Nietzsche's concept of the Superman that, quote, an erudite Bavarian, end quote, once commented to him, quote, every idiot fancies himself an Übermensch, end quote. Nietzsche could often correctly ridicule the caricatures of Christianity that followed after German pietism and the thinking of Schleiermacher. Little did he realize what greater absurdities, sophomoric nonsense, and great evils would follow after him. His own life was full of ironies. The scholar Paul Ray influenced him greatly. They clashed over the love of Lou Andrea Salome, and Ray was more successful than Nietzsche. Ray was Jewish. Nietzsche was no lover of Jews. Most people experience frustrations and failures in their lifetime, but Nietzsche experienced everything as frustration and failure. Quote, one quality he had, a terrific pride. He said that he was too proud to make friends, for none alive were of the same rank. End quote. Life as a superman can be very lonely. Nietzsche was a classical scholar. He lived in an era when wisdom was located in Hellenic life, thought, and philosophy. This severely limited his perspective. He was essentially ignorant of the Middle Ages and of the Reformation. His view of the Bible was warped by Greek concepts which could never be successfully superimposed on the Scriptures. As a result, the biblical view of God was repellent to him. The Greek idea of the supreme God, the God of Aristotle, was a transcendent being, too great and too unmovable ever to condescend to create the world. In fact, for Hellenism as a whole, as Madigan has shown, quote, no God could touch matter and still remain a God, end quote. For this reason, Gnosticism insisted that all creation and revelation was the work of a realm of powers below God, the demiurges. Nietzsche found distasteful the idea of a God concerned about humanity, about the incarnation and redemption of man as God's grace and love. Nietzsche mocked this Christian God and found it ironic that, when this God spoke to all the world in the New Testament, he spoke in Greek, and not too well, Nietzsche claimed. Of course, the New Testament is in Koine Greek, not the classical Greek of the philosophers and playwrights. There is a sad aspect to all of Nietzsche's attacks on Christianity. The academic world around him was politely indifferent to Christianity for the most part. They were waiting for its quiet death and its disappearance into the past. As Figgis noted of Nietzsche, quote, he was not a man of the world, end quote. In the Church's sense of the words, he was worldly, but he was not a man of the world. He sought disciples, not students. He spoke and lived intensely conscious of Christianity in a way other philosophers of his century were not. His hatred of Christ and Christianity was intense from first to last. He was like a renegade priest who fights the Church to his dying day. There are times when, in reading Nietzsche, one suspects, as did Figgis, that he hated it, not because he disbelieved it, but because he hated Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, as the antithesis of Dionysius, was to Nietzsche the classicist, the epitome of all that he detested. As a good Greek classicist, he helped recreate the priority of the state and the 20th century world wars over the articles of statist faith. The worst conflicts may well be ahead of us. No statues to Nietzsche will honour him for his part in shaping the 20th century. A final word. As I wrote the foregoing, a telephone call from a friend working with youth who live in the streets interrupted me. She reported a radical indifference to Christianity on the most part. Their intense interests were the theatre and the dance. Life was not lived in the eyes of God, but before men. Life was to them a stage for performance, a place for showing off. The world of Nietzsche had found some of its focus.